A woman spends years searching for answers to her baby brother's death, but the answers she gets will send her hunting for a deeper truth. This is the Tracyraquel Burns story. Hi, Amy.
Hey, Meghan. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? Are you summer ready?
Yeah, sure. It's funny though, because it's so cold in my studio because it's in the basement that
Always.
like you said, like I'm always wearing like winter clothes no matter what season it is.
No matter what, but you're always cold. So
Yeah, that's
but
true. That's
your
true.
basement is very cold.
Freezing.
That's true.
Yes.
You are kind of summer ready. We're like both getting ready to leave for trips. And
Yep.
Oh my goodness. I'm already panicking because I'm flying in like a couple weeks.
You'll be fine.
No, I have to be fine because I have to set a good example for
Yeah.
for Hannah. I refuse to have her like adopt this thing that I have the fear of flying that I got from my mom partially.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I am going to set a better example. In the meantime, we are, and I'm also coming to visit you next week before we go. Yay.
You are.
I know.
Yay.
I'm excited.
I'm excited too.
We have good stuff coming up, but we also have a lot to record. And I have some cases that I am very jazzed about, including today's. So I'll get to it. Today's story is one that has elements of trauma, survival, truth, and justice, but also touches on the legal process and a lot more. It's one of those stories that kind of has it all, I have to say. And I stumbled across a documentary about this case that I don't think is that well known. It wasn't like on the top of a list. It was just kind of me, clicking through. And I'm going to reference this doc at the end, but I don't want to give anything away quite yet. So we'll hold for that, okay? Or stay tuned at the end for that. It's interesting, though, because I also want to point out I recently listened to an episode of 48 Hours with Erin Moriarty, who I love. And she said when people ask her about how she can work on such horrific cases for so long, she said that she just focuses on the heroes of the story. And I really think that's how we should approach today's case. Or that is my approach.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to introduce you to the person who I think is the hero of this story. And I hope you will think so too. Tracyraquel Burns, or Tracy, as I'll be calling her throughout the episode. Born in Decatur, Georgia in 1969, Tracy's parents, Kathy Allman and Jan Sandlin, did not exactly have a traditional beginning to their relationship. They met quite young and dated in high school, but Kathy's mother definitely did not approve of bad boy Jan. This was especially true after Kathy became pregnant by Jan at only age 15. When she found out, Kathy's mother took her to a doctor, and she said that the doctor was just going to check on the baby to make sure everything was okay, when in reality, he performed an illegal abortion on the unsuspecting teenager.
What year is this? We're talking about the 70s, 80s, right?
So,
You said she was 16.
well, Tracy was born in 1969, so this was a couple of years before. So yes, this was the 60s. But also understand she didn't realize that was why she was going to the doctor.
Oh, it was Tracy. I'm sorry. It was Tracy's mother.
It was Tracy's mother.
Okay.
Now, after losing the baby, Kathy and Jan broke up, and Kathy began seeing a young man named Ted Golder, who was enlisted in the U.S. Army at the time. And by all accounts, he was the opposite of Jan's bad boy. He was a good guy. The two married right after Kathy graduated high school, but Ted went overseas to fight in the Vietnam War, and Kathy, she just couldn't resist the draw to Jan. I think that's where her heart was always at. Despite her marriage, she began seeing Jan again at every opportunity. So when she got pregnant with Tracy in 1969, she claimed that Jan was Tracy's father and not her husband, Ted. So she had kind of sent him like a letter, maybe a Dear John letter saying, this baby's not yours and I'm leaving you. However, they did stay married for some time and saw each other. I think at some point they tried to work it out. The reality is, Kathy never stopped seeing Jan. But Kathy and Jan's relationship was tumultuous, resulting in several breakups and reunifications. During one of these breakups in 1971, Kathy decided to work on her marriage with Ted. But then, ultimately, she went back to Jan yet again. However, Kathy found out that she was pregnant in the winter of 1971. And at this point, We weren't quite sure whose child this was going to be. Was this Jan or Ted's? The timing was too close to know for certain. But as a show of her commitment to Jan, Kathy told Ted that she didn't love him and that she was leaving him. In September of 1971, Kathy gave birth to a little boy named Matthew, and she officially left Ted and moved her 2 children in with Jan. However, it becomes quickly apparent that the little boy is Ted's son and not Jan's.
How's it become apparent?
You could see, I think.
Okay.
And sometimes I wouldn't always say that, but I think also Kathy may have admitted this as well, but I think it was, they could tell by the look of the child that it was Ted's. Now, 4 months later, in December of 1971, a 2-year-old Tracy needed to go to the doctor. So Kathy left baby Matthew in Jan's care to take Tracy to the doctor and then to run to the laundromat. There was a report, by the way, that the reason Tracy needed to go to the doctor was from a fall and her ears were bleeding. I couldn't get the full story on this, but this is partially in the documentary, and I'll come back to it later. So they go to the doctor, they go to the laundromat. When they return home, Tracy followed her mother up to the nursery where baby Matthew was sleeping. But something was wrong, and Kathy panicked, screaming for Jan, and they rushed Matthew to the ER. He was unresponsive. Tragically, though the doctors did everything they could, the 4-month-old Matthew died on the table. Kathy was devastated, as any mother would be, and there was some confusion at that time as to what the cause of death was. Things got bad after this as well between Kathy and Jan. Kathy was so gutted by Matthew's death that just a few months later, she jumped off their 2nd or 3rd floor balcony in front of Tracy.
Just a quick question. What does Jan say happened? He just said the baby was asleep?
Right. Hold for that. I'll come back. At this point, there isn't a clear story, but there will be. So Kathy is devastated. She literally jumps from her balcony, but she survives. Only breaking her legs and her arms, but then she's in a full body cast.
Oh, wow.
Her recovery was long and painful, and mentally, it's possible that Kathy never recovered. In later interviews, Tracy said that this was also an awful time. At just 2 years old, she had to take care of herself and found herself taking care of her mother, taking care of the house chores. She describes making scrambled eggs, standing on a chair on the stove at 2 years old with her mom yelling at her to do it in the background, which I find hard to fathom, a 2-year-old doing this. Then when Tracy was 5, her mother had another son, a baby named Jason. And this was Jan's child, and she became his caretaker as well. But the new baby did not solve the relationship between Tracy's parents. Kathy and Jan fought constantly, breaking up and getting back together over and over again. By the time Tracy was school age, the family was living in the northern part of Atlanta, Georgia. But they moved constantly, which meant Tracy changed schools frequently and had a hard time making friends and finding a stable community. Jan had also become physically abusive towards her, and Kathy, she said, was neglectful. While Tracy claims that she never hit her, she said that her mother was cold, cruel, emotionally abusive. And she said that Jan was also very physically abusive to Kathy. So their tumultuous relationship, a lot of it, you might describe as just violence from Jan towards Kathy. At least it escalated to that. Despite this horrible home life, Tracy tried very hard to be a, normal kind of girl in high school. She did her best to fit in sports and make friends, but by the time she was 15, Tracy openly admitted that she felt depressed. And one night in 1983, she was woken up in the middle of the night by her mother, who drove her to a state psychiatric hospital to help her with her sadness, perhaps, but Tracy said it was awful, a place with violent criminal offenders. And she believed that her mother was actually trying to get rid of her.
How old was she? I'm sorry.
She was 15 at the time.
Okay.
Her aunt actually quickly got her out of the hospital and brought her home. But Tracy did say that she had suicidal thoughts and rounded up a bunch of prescription meds, and she overdosed. She said that she hoped to be with Matthew, but much to her surprise, and she was not happy, She survived. It was that survival, though, she said, that made her realize that she needed to find out what had actually happened to her baby brother, because she had never really gotten the full story at all. It was one of those things that you just didn't talk about. She felt like if she found some answers, if she could resolve this part of her life, perhaps her depression would go away. Maybe she would feel better. So she began to question her mother about Matthew, but Kathy would not speak on it, demanding that Tracy drop it. So Tracy went to the police station and got a copy of the incident report. Now, it didn't say much, unfortunately. It said there was an accident and a child had to go to the hospital, at which point he passed. Nobody investigated this accident as a crime, and Tracy felt disappointed at not knowing more. But by 18 years old, Tracy also said that she was done with Jan and Kathy. She was done being a punching bag for both of them, and she left home and joined the army. She was stationed overseas for some time, where she met her husband and got married. She went on to have 2 children, and in creating a family, she felt, she said, even more compelled to investigate Matthew's death. So she went ahead as an adult and requested medical records from the hospital where Matthew had died, and she was able to get access to them. And she said she was pretty shocked when she received the documents. Not only did the autopsy results show that Matthew had sustained skull fractures, the surgeon noted it looked like, quote, if you took your fist and put it through a watermelon.
So why would this not be investigated at the time?
Well, the most shocking part was what Tracy's mother had told the doctors. Her story was that Tracy had thrown her baby brother from the crib.
Oh.
And Tracy said she couldn't believe the words on the page, that Tracy had gotten into the crib and thrown him over. She actually questioned, had she killed her own brother?
That's not even physically possible. A 2-year-old can probably not even lift a 4-month-old.
I'm glad you pointed that out. Tracy called her grandmother and asked if this was true, and her grandmother said yes, and that's why they never talked about it. Nobody ever wanted to make her feel bad.
Whoa.
But she still couldn't believe it, so she called her mother. But Kathy reiterated what the hospital basically said, the paperwork said. She had accidentally dropped her brother from his crib, and ultimately she was responsible for his death. And this is why the family wouldn't talk about it. Tracy was heavily disturbed by this truth of her brother's death. Obviously, thinking she had killed her brother was one of the worst things you could possibly imagine. She said one day in 1994, as she watched her 2-year-old daughter fail at dragging a gallon of milk across their kitchen floor, she had an epiphany. This gallon of milk weighed around 8 pounds, which was too heavy for her 2-year-old to actually drag. And then she thought, well, how could a 2-year-old manage to pick up her baby brother, who then at the time was about 14 pounds, and throw him over a crib rail hard enough to shatter his skull?
Is a gallon of milk really 8 pounds?
Well, I looked it up.
That feels heavy.
I
right?
know. A toddler couldn't carry this. And yes, I'll have you know, I looked it up just again. And yes, it's just over 8 pounds, which,
Wow.
yeah, I
Okay.
know. That's pretty heavy. But at this moment, she pointed out what you did before, Amy. This isn't possible. She couldn't have done this. Someone had to have been lying. So Tracy started making calls, and she said she didn't stop. She called the police of DeKalb County, the FBI, the medical examiner's office, every law enforcement agency she could think of until someone would listen to her story and take her seriously.
How is that not a red flag to anyone reading that report, that a 2-year-old could throw a 4-month-old over?
I do not know how this was accepted. I mean, it was the 60s. It was a different time.
Yeah.
But I would have to agree. The medical examiner kind of took this for what it was and declared it was an accident. And that's how it went down. But now it was different. People were beginning to listen. And particularly one of the investigators from the medical examiner's office, he had investigated homicides, and he had heard the name of Tracy's father, Jan Sandlin, before. Jan's name had come up in the 1971 shooting of a police officer, since Jan was connected to a violent drug gang called the Dixie Mafia. Jan's affiliation had placed him as a potential suspect in this crime, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest him. But there was more than just his possible involvement in the shooting. Before Jan married Kathy, he'd been married to another woman named Nancy Tadager, who'd become pregnant by him. Now, Jan reportedly did not want children and also did not believe the child was his for reasons I'm not sure of. And in 1971, Nancy died of a gunshot wound to the abdomen. And at the time, it was ruled a suicide.
Oh, boy. I'm assuming, unfortunately, the baby passed away.
Yes. This is not common, suicide by abdomen. So it was quite suspicious, especially to people who knew Nancy. And
did they investigate it at all?
It was not investigated at all, from what I could see.
So her boyfriend, I'm sorry, was it her boyfriend or husband at the time?
Jan, they were married.
So did her husband just say she did this herself and they just took his word for it?
That's correct.
Well, I guess we could say we've come a ways then, because that would not happen today.
No, it would not. And we
Okay.
have come a ways. And guess what? Just a few weeks later, Kathy and Jan moved in together.
Oh, boy. Okay.
A decade later, in 1981, Jan was arrested for armed robbery in Florida and sentenced to life in prison.
Oh.
So with a rap sheet, the police opened an investigation in 1995 for Jan's potential involvement in Matthew's death.
And where was he now?
Well, now he was in prison for
Oh.
that armed robbery.
Okay.
Okay. And he had been there for quite some time. In 1997, baby Matthew's body was exhumed for a new autopsy. And, you know, one of the people in the documentary said how he felt it. They felt bad about it. They felt it was like waking a sleeping baby.
Oh.
You know, everyone felt bad about this. People took this really personally who got involved.
Yeah.
What they found, in addition to his head trauma being too severe, they believe to have been caused by a fall, just a fall, he had a third-degree burn on his foot.
What?
It
Wait, that wasn't in the original autopsy?
No. And I believe they thought it looked like a cigarette burn. He had a healed but what seemed to be previously broken clavicle, bruising on his body, including his penis.
Did Jan smoke cigarettes?
Yes, he did. But I believe Kathy may have also smoked cigarettes. This was enough evidence for a grand jury, though, to indict Jan on charges of murder because they brought this to a grand jury afterwards. Now, Jan was, as I said, already incarcerated in Florida, but he'd now be extradited to Georgia to stand trial for the murder of 4-month-old Matthew Golder. The trial began in July of 1997. The prosecution had an uphill battle, though. The injuries to Matthew that were older were not admissible because they couldn't prove that Jan inflicted them. And they weren't connected to that same event, to his death. They also couldn't tell a jury that Jan was serving a life sentence for a violent robbery because it was prejudicial and not relevant. So Jan was there in regular clothes appearing before the jury. But they could argue that the head injury was not an accident and that Matthew had been alone with Jan, and that there was no way a 2-year-old could have climbed into the crib, lifted the baby, and thrown him out.
How could they tell that it wasn't accidental in any other way?
They said the force to the skull.
The force.
Yes, it was the force to the skull.
Okay.
They also argued that Matthew was not Jan's son. He was Ted's, and Jan did not want him and certainly did not want to be left alone to watch him at any point. So what was Jan's defense here? Well, Jan had a defense, and the defense was that Kathy Amon killed her son.
I knew you were going to say that. I'm like, they're just going to, because they're not together anymore. They're angry at each other.
Yes. So they decided not to stick with the accidental story. And this battle was going to play out in the courtroom. Tracy was called to testify, of course. Now, she wasn't really an eyewitness. She was 2 years old and didn't remember much, but she was able to speak of Jan's abuse of her mother and of her and his general attitude towards the children. She also testified about her suspicions and how she came to pursue an investigation into her brother's death, so how this all unfolded. But very importantly, she also testified about a recorded conversation that she had with her mother just before the trial. It was during this conversation that Kathy told Tracy it was easier to say that this was just an accident than to say that Jan had killed Matthew.
Easier for who?
She had said there are things you do for the man you love. It was easier to believe it was an accident than to believe Jan did it, to point the finger at him. While this supported the prosecution's theory, the defense also used it to suggest that Kathy was a liar, and she had always lied about Matthew, about his death, and that she was lying again.
She couldn't be charged with anything, could she?
Why not?
Like concealing evidence, obstruction to justice?
Why not?
Yeah.
I mean, she technically could be charged.
Yeah.
However, the prosecution called her as a witness. So I have to imagine she also might have had some type of deal, possibly.
I would also imagine the statute of limitations for obstruction of justice would be expired by now. We're talking, what, almost 30 years?
Well, I'm not saying they could have called her for obstruction, but why couldn't she have been? If they believe she was involved in the crime, they could have charged her with conspiracy, collusion, homicide itself.
Mm-hmm.
So what would she say when she took the stand? Well, she claimed that she took Tracy to the doctors and to the laundromat just as they had said on that day that Matthew died. She said that she came home and she took Tracy in first, but before she could get to check on Matthew, Jan kind of jumped in and said, "Don't go into his room. He's sleeping. You should go get the laundry out of the car." According to Kathy, that's what she did. She went and got the laundry, and when she came back, she found Tracy in Matthew's crib, and Matthew was lying on the floor. She was hysterical. She said that she tried to wake him, but Matthew was unresponsive. She said that Jan spanked Tracy, saying that it was Tracy's fault that Matthew was on the floor, even though it was an accident.
So he staged this whole scene. So she's saying that that the only thing she knew was that this happened because Jan staged it. Okay.
Correct. If you think about how sick this is, though, he actually spanked Tracy as part of this scene. Kathy explained that she hadn't thought that Jan killed him in that moment. But after years and looking back, she felt differently now. She believed that Jan had tricked her into getting the laundry so that he could put Tracy in the bed and blame Matthew's death on her, even though he had probably been the one to kill the baby. The trial was moving along and it was coming to an end. But then there was a big problem that no one anticipated. So Tracy was a witness and she was not supposed to watch any part of the trial because technically she could be called again as a witness. But she saw Kathy testify when someone else in her house had the television on. And she reported it to the prosecutors. And the prosecutors had a duty to report it to the judge.
Mistrial?
It was a bigger problem than they originally thought. The judge called Tracy back to court, this time no jury. He questioned Tracy about what she had heard, and Tracy said that she had heard some of Kathy's testimony, not much. She wasn't actively listening. It was kind of a pass-through situation. The prosecution thought that it probably wouldn't be a harm to the defense, but the judge believed differently. He thought this was a pretty egregious violation that could prejudice Jan's right to a fair trial. So Jan's counsel motioned for a mistrial, and it was granted. And just like that, the trial was over.
But he's going back to prison, so that's good.
He was already in prison and was also at the judge's discretion right now to decide whether or not to allow a retrial. So he wanted to consider whether or not it was so prejudicial that a retrial would not be fair.
Yeah, because they don't have a case without her testifying.
They do.
Right?
No, they had
Really?
they had a case without her testimony. They could build around that. Yeah,
Okay.
They could certainly look at, I'll explain. They had other testimony, which I'll get to. But meanwhile, in between, or when the judge was deciding, according to Tracy, she received a call from Jan the day after the mistrial was declared. She said that he was laughing and threatened to set Tracy on fire and burn her to death.
And he called her from prison?
So that's what I was thinking.
Come on.
He had to have called her from prison.
Doesn't
but
he know these are recorded?
I didn't hear that in the documentary, though. I just want to say that's why this is according to Tracy. If those calls were recorded, if they were saved, they were not played for the access for the documentary. Although I don't doubt that she's telling the truth. She said that there were a few more calls as well that came from Jan, with the last one playing audio from a television show in the background that was discussing this awful case where a child's legs had been run over by a lawnmower.
Oh.
Tracy said she knew in an instant that Jan was now threatening not only her, but also her children. She was terrified, but luckily the judge allowed a retrial, and that would happen just 2 months later. The witness list was pretty much the same for the second trial, but the judge was certainly being more careful and watching everything as if he wasn't careful before. Now there was real scrutiny, so there was pressure to make sure that everything went right. The medical examiner testified on the skull fractures to Matthew's head, about the skull fractures to Matthew's head, saying that it was caused, and this was really one of the key pieces of testimony here, it was caused by him being struck on the side of the head while his head was on a surface. So he had to be lying down, and he was struck, and it created fractures on both sides of his head. It couldn't have happened from a fall. It happened from a strike.
Do you think he was sleeping when it happened?
I think he was probably crying when it happened. It's so awful. It really is awful. Tracy's grandmother was actually called to testify as well. She testified to a prior incident with Matthew and Jan. So Matthew, the baby, had gotten pepper in his eye while he was alone with Jan, which would create such pain. And this was allowed because it was prior conduct that was similar. While he was alone with Jan, he was injured. But the defense, they stuck to the same story, and that was that Kathy Almond was a liar, and she had been the one to blame Tracy because she had been the one to murder her child, and it was not Jan. She was the one, in fact, who created the story. She was the one who lied.
Isn't it so horrible in these cases that there has to be this like alternative narrative because that's what jurors want to hear. And oftentimes it leads to just these false accusations against other people.
Yes, I do agree. However, not everyone thought that Kathy was totally innocent either.
Right.
So just reserve that. But yes, I do agree in trials where this happens. Jan did not testify at either of these trials, but he wasn't exactly silent with his expressions. Jan smirked and smiled at witnesses at time, and I saw the smirk in the documentary, and it was uncomfortable. He made eye contact with the prosecutor a lot, and he almost looked like he was enjoying the testimony of others because they were uncomfortable. That was what I read from it. Not that makes him guilty of murder, but it certainly wasn't a good look. So what would the jury think in the end? There were multiple charges against Jan. So the jury began with count 1, malice murder, not guilty. On count 2, felony murder, guilty. And guilty on all other counts.
The felony being what? Child abuse?
Yes. So they believed that he was guilty of killing Matthew, but not with premeditation or the intention. They believe he hit him so hard he died.
So during the commission of the felony of child abuse?
Yes.
Okay.
And that should have been the end of the story. But 1 year later, something nobody could have anticipated happened again. Jan's defense attorney, Corinne Mull, claimed that she was ineffective for Jan's appeal. So that's very rare. We've talked about these cases where ineffective counsel is suggested. However, usually the lawyer will dispute that they were ineffective. It seems that Corinne Mull threw herself under the bus. And in this appeal, and in doing so, the court granted him a third trial.
Okay, what were the claims?
I don't know what the claims were.
Oh, really?
No, I don't know what the claims. And by all accounts, she was a strong attorney. She zealously advocated for Jan. So this was kind of a surprise for everyone. The only claim I imagine that maybe she might have had was that she didn't call experts to refute the testimony.
That's still surprising that there was a win on appeal based on ineffective counsel.
Well, yes. I mean,
I don't think sometimes.
I don't think anyone thought, though, that Corinne was ineffective, but maybe Corinne. And maybe, look, she felt that she could have done more. So this meant that they were going to trial 3 in 1998, and this time with a new defense attorney. And this time, the defense decided to return to the original story that Tracy had pushed her brother out of the crib. What about the science? Well, this defense attorney said it was subjective, but no medical examiner would testify for them. So no expert. And this defense attorney later in the documentary said, of course, no medical examiner wanted to testify against the prosecution in this case. Nobody wanted to stake their reputation on it. But we still believed it was an accident, and that was the story. This didn't help Jan, though, this second story. In November of 1998, the jury found him guilty a second time, and the relief in the courtroom this time was palpable. Jan would spend the rest of his life in prison for this crime, as well as his others. But what happened after the trial? Well, in 2024, Jan, who'd been incarcerated for 24 years, agreed to do an interview with the producer for the documentary Burden of Guilt. So that's the documentary that I watched. It is also a podcast.
I was going to say, it sounds like a podcast.
Yes,
okay.
It's a podcast.
Uh-huh.
And he offered his version of the story. Remember, he had not testified, so this would be his belated testimony, if you will. His version is that when Kathy and Tracy came home from the doctor and the laundromat the day Matthew died, they came up and Kathy told Jan to go get the laundry from the car, not the other way around.
Why wouldn't his defense attorneys have said that earlier?
Well, yeah, remember, he had a defense in the second one. His defense attorney did blame Kathy, but his last defense attorney thought that strategy, it wasn't successful. So we have to go with the original story. He said when he returned to the apartment, Kathy was in the bedroom holding Matthew, saying that something was wrong with the baby. So I guess maybe he's saying he didn't know. Something happened while he was out of the apartment. And yes, it seemed like Kathy was responsible, but he kind of left that open. And he said they immediately left for the hospital. According to Jan, he had never hurt a child in his life. Now, Tracy has a much different recollection of Jan, in which he spent a great deal of her childhood beating her, putting cigarettes out on her. She claimed she claimed that he served roaches and butter on toast while masturbating as a form of punishment to her at times. So according to her story, there are elements of sexual abuse and extreme physical abuse. I don't know how long, how pervasive. This is according to Tracy, that he was abusive. Jan denied physically abusing both of his wives, also despite the evidence to the contrary, which included witnesses to the physical violence. He suggested that the producers speak with Kathy Almond. So they made a visit to her house and requested her side of the story. I've seen this before. People just show up at your door. Hi, we want to do an interview. I get annoyed when people knock on the door to sell me something.
How old are these people now, Kathy and Jan? They're pretty...
Jan's in his 80s and Kathy was also close, I believe, very close to him.
Okay.
So she lived with her sister, Sheila. And when she opened the door, she said, no, I can't get involved in this anymore. But she said Tracy had been lying and torturing her for over 30 years and her nerves were shot. So her anger seemed to be directed at Tracy, her daughter. Her sister Sheila agreed to come outside and speak with the producer. And she said that Kathy was not abusive ever, nor was she involved in Matthew's death. But she went further. She also said that Tracy was never abused. She said Tracy was a liar and a person for whom she had no sympathy.
Wow. I wonder why so much hatred towards Tracy.
Yeah, it seemed a lot of blame on Tracy. Despite what her family says, though, just so you know, Tracy not only survived this horrific childhood, being blamed for her brother's death, neglect, really an all-round awful experience as a child. She not only survived it, though, but she is thriving. She is happily married with 2 children and grandchildren now. She has a very fulfilling life, and she says that Jan and Kathy, who she refers to as Jan and Kathy, not as her mother and father, she says they don't mean anything to her anymore, that she let go of the anger a long time ago, and it's just that they're insignificant now to her life. Her children and her husband, they spoke also on the documentary, and it is clear that they adore her. They say that she is the strongest, most loving person. Interestingly, Tracy, I said I'd come back to this. Tracy believes that Kathy and Jan intended to kill both her and her brother so that they could start over. So Kathy had said a couple of times that after Matthew's death, they just wanted to start over and put it behind them. The day that she went to the doctors, according to Tracy, it was for a physical assault by Jan, and she was bleeding from her ears. There wasn't much more about that, but Tracy believed that Kathy was involved in Matthew's death as well, and that they did plan to kill her. There is no proof of that, but that is her belief. Tracy had a terribly difficult childhood, marked by abuse, loss, a lack of love, but she got exactly what she deserved as an adult, even if it wasn't from the people who should have given it to her. She's also a hero, if you ask me, seeking truth and justice for the one person who could never do so for himself. So in this case, I find that the system failed Tracy. It failed completely, failed Nancy Tedegger, the woman who was ruled a suicide. But Tracy took it upon herself to demand that the system correct its failure. And in the end, I have to tell you, I found her so inspiring, and I just wish her so much happiness and prosperity going forward.
I can't wait to listen to that podcast.
Right? Oh my goodness. I started the documentary, then I saw the podcast, but I finished the documentary. And it's one of those stories that I said it kind of has a little bit of everything. Like, what? You didn't know this would happen in the justice system? And,
interesting.
Yeah, it was a very interesting case for me as well. All right. Before we go today, I'd like to take this opportunity to answer a question from a patron.
I actually think we have two today.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Want me to go
you
first?
Could go.
Okay.
Yeah, you go first, and then I'll tell you the one I just pulled.
Alrighty. First question. What are your thoughts, personal experiences with the benefits of providing an education to people who are incarcerated? I've read that it helps recidivism, and I'm personally interested in getting involved somehow.
Well, I think I'll take that one.
I think so.
For the last decade, I've been teaching in maximum security prisons. I teach for a program that gives students bachelor degrees in justice studies. And as you know, it has been the greatest joy of my life, besides my children, of course. I absolutely love it. The students are incredible. I've learned more than they've definitely taught me more than I could ever teach them. And a lot of people focus on the benefits for recidivism, but I think there's so much more than that. It just, education should be, afforded to everyone, regardless of what they do. I think education gives people hope. It gives people the tools they need to just survive day to day in prison. It helps confidence. It increases social networks. There's so many far-reaching benefits that I actually, when I think of the benefits of education in prison, for me, recidivism is pretty far down.
That's so interesting.
Because all of these other things lead to reduced recidivism anyway. You're also being such a good role model for your kids when you're getting your degree while you're incarcerated without computers, without phones, and you're able to do it. And it's not dumbed down. It's not easier. They have the exact same curriculum as students on campus. So,
well, Amy, I knew you'd have the absolute answer. I just want to add one thing to that because it has stuck with me for years. One of the lifers, the men in the lifers group in Rahway, told me that when they brought education to the prisons, it totally changed the culture of the prison, even the way people spoke to each other.
Yep. He would say on the yard, we're no longer talking about the drugs we used to push. We're debating Aristotle.
Yes.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah,
it's very cool.
And it's inspiring. It's inspiring to other people because a lot of the students in the program are older.
Yeah.
And it inspires the younger guys and women in the women's prison to get involved in education too.
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question. And thank you. Amy, you said you have a second one.
Yeah, so I'm going to let you start with this question since I started with the next one. This is another Patreon question. And this question is, what can women do to protect themselves from being victimized?
Oh, that's a great question. There are so many things we can do to protect ourselves. But the first one, I think of routine activities theory. Do not have the same routine every single day and every single night. Having the same routine makes you more susceptible to victimization and being a target. I also say target hardening is great. So make yourself a harder target. For me, I did very simple things all the time. Like when I was younger and entering my apartment building, always look behind you. I never would walk straight in. I always held my keys out. I always had...
Like in between your fingers, so you could use it as...
I mean, just these like small life hacks. And trust your instincts. That's really
I
the
was
best
going to
thing.
say, for me, that's number one.
Number one, when I feel uncomfortable, like if I get a bad feeling, I just go with your instinct on that. Absolutely. And don't feel that bad about it later on, because your instincts a lot of times are what will protect you.
I think a lot of women are people pleasers. We're codependent. I'm speaking for myself when I say that as well. So you don't want to come off as rude. If, you don't want to insult someone by maybe, crossing the street or doing something that makes you look like you're avoiding someone. But it's so important to, put your instincts ahead of all of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Such a good question. And I don't think it hurts to have self-defense. I've been saying this for years that I want to take self-defense classes. I still haven't, but.
I mean, I don't think it hurts to have a 60-pound pit bull either named Chloe.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the questions. And if you have a question for us, feel free to message us at womeninCrimePodcast.com. And as a reminder, if you're a patron at the Lifer tier, your question is guaranteed to be read on air. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. That's our episode for today. We hope to catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonso. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include the documentary Burden of Guilt, Sandlin v. State, 2001, the appeal transcript, and the Tampa Bay Times.